The night in London was quiet, too quiet. While the city slept, under the stone walls they were already waiting. Marble tables, damp air, the smell of cold which you can't confuse with anything living. In Victorian London, there were places where people only went once, sometimes sooner than they should have. Because in a city where death was commonplace, the scariest thing was not to die, but to wake up where you were already considered dead. Pause. What really happened behind the morgue doors? Who decided that life was over? And could you survive the night among those who no longer had the right to breathe? This is not a horror story. This is history. Subscribe if you're ready to enter. When the door closes. The door closes, and the sound is not harsh. It is dull, heavy, almost polite. This is how doors close in places where no one is in a hurry, where time no longer matters to those who lie inside. Victorian London knew how to be a noisy city. It was full of shouting cabbies, factories, markets, drunken voices, bargaining, quarrels, a life that was seething even in the dirt. But here the city fell silent. The morgue did not look like a hospital. It did not look like a church. It did not even look like a place of mourning. It looked like a pause, the space between what had already happened and what had not yet had time to understand. The air here had a different weight. It was colder, wetter, still. The smell is complex: stone, water, metal, and something almost elusive, something that cannot be named aloud. Marble tables stood in rows. The light of the lamps slid across their surface as if afraid to linger. The whiteness of the marble was not soothing. It emphasized every shape, every shadow, every stillness. There was no sleep in the morgue. There was only waiting. 19th century London was a city of death as well as a city of opportunity. People died here often, from disease, from cold, from hunger, from work, from the accidents that happened in the city every day. Death was no exception. It was a statistic, and the city needed places where death became orderly. The morgue was just such a place. Those found on the streets were brought here, in alleys, in rooms where no one called a doctor, those no one recognized, sometimes those who were not really searched for. But the scariest thing about the Victorian morgue was not that, not the cold, not the silence, not the marble, but the uncertainty. Because in the 19th century, the line between alive and dead was much thinner than we would like to think. Medicine did not yet have the tools we are used to. There were no monitors. There were no machines. There were no clear protocols. There were the doctor's eyes and his decision. Breathing could be barely noticeable. Pulse almost imperceptible. The body is cold after a fever or a loss of consciousness. Sometimes a person did not look alive, but they were not dead yet. The fear of being buried alive haunted Victorian society. Newspapers wrote about it, families whispered about it, horror stories were made up about it. And this fear was not unfounded. There were real cases when the coffin was opened later and traces of a struggle were found inside. Scratches, broken nails, twisted postures, silent evidence of panic. The morgue became an intermediate stop, a place where the body awaited confirmation of death, or recognition, or a solution. And in that pause, in that cold delay between diagnosis and burial, there was real tension. Imagine, the darkness is not yet complete, but the light is not enough. The lamps flicker. The footsteps sound different, dull on stone. Somewhere water drips. Somewhere a closet door creaks. Somewhere the fabric shifts barely perceptibly. By chance, maybe. The morgue workers were used to silence. They were used to immobility, to bodies that no longer react. They were so used to it that sometimes they stopped noticing little things. A barely noticeable movement of the chest, a faint sound, an almost inaudible exhalation. Because the morgue is a place where the living are not expected. And yet, sometimes the impossible happened. One of the most disturbing fears of the era is a person waking up in a morgue. Not in a coffin, not yet. On the marble table, under the cloth, in the cold, in the dark. In a space where everyone is already sure, too late. Try to feel it. First comes the cold, not sharp, slow. The one that seeps into the skin, into the muscles, into the mind. Then, misunderstanding. Where are you? Why is it so dark? Why doesn't the body obey right away? And then, sound, footsteps, voice, metal. The morgue in Victorian London was not a place of horror in our modern sense. It was part of a system, part of the city's mechanism, rational, cold, unemotional. But it was precisely this mundanity that made it scary, because no miracle was expected here, and if a miracle happened, it was often late. Those whom the city didn't remember. They rarely came to the morgue with a name, more often with a description. A man, about 40. A woman, young. Found on the side of the road. Undocumented. No one reported. Victorian London was a city that knew how to swallow people. Every day new faces arrived here, in search of work, food, a chance, salvation. And every day some of those faces disappeared. Without witnesses, without family nearby, without anyone to ask, "Where is he?" or "What's wrong with her?" Poverty in the 19th century was not just a lack of money, it was a state of invisibility. If you were poor in London, your life became quieter for the system. Your illnesses were less urgent, your disappearances were less noticeable, your deaths were less unusual. The morgue became a place where the fates of those whom the city did not have time to remember converged. Those who lived in cheap rooms without heat, in basements, in crowded slums. Those whose addresses were temporary and whose neighbors were random. Imagine a narrow room. The walls were damp. The air was stuffy. The bed was a convention. People here were sick for a long time, and often in silence, because calling a doctor cost money, and money meant food, and the choice was simple: to endure. When such a person stopped moving, it was not always noticed immediately. Sometimes after hours, sometimes after a day, sometimes when the landlord realized that no one would pay the rent anymore. The body was taken away, not as a tragedy, as a procedure. London had thousands of such stories, nameless, unrecorded, almost erased. But the morgues remembered them, in magazines, in records, in dry lines, unknown, unrecognized, no relatives. The death statistics in the Victorian city were cold. They did not distinguish between drama and mundanity. If you died in a hospital, a record. If on the street, a record. If in an asylum, a record. If no one recognized you, you became a problem. Because death without a name is not only sadness. This is a question for the authorities. Who is this person? Are there relatives? Was a crime committed? Where to hide? And while there were no answers, the body waited in the cold. The marble tables in morgues were never an accident. The stone kept the temperature. The cold slowed down the changes. It gave more time for inspection, for recognition, for a decision. But the cold had another effect. It erased the sense of life. The skin turned pale. The body hardened. The features became immobile. The line between unconscious and dead became even less obvious, especially in a city where people were often exhausted, hungry, sick, frozen. Imagine a policeman in the fog. The lantern shines weakly. On the cobblestones is a figure, motionless, cold, unresponsive. Decisions must be made quickly. The city cannot wait long. The body is sent to the morgue, and here, a different kind of silence begins. Because in Victorian London, a false death announcement was not a fantasy. It was a risk. Stories of awakenings roamed the city like shadows. They were feared. They were denied. They were discussed in whispers. People invented fuses, safe coffins, bells inside, signal mechanisms, insurance against premature burial. Fear became an industry. But the coffin had yet to be reached. Before that, there was a cold room, morgue, a place where the body was already considered lifeless, a place where movement was not expected, a place where a mistake could go unnoticed for too long. Because if a person regained consciousness, they woke up not in bed, not at home, not among loved ones, but on a stone, in the cold, in silence. Sometimes there were others nearby, just as quiet, just as motionless, just as finally resolved. The morgue was an archive of urban indifference, a place where poverty completed its logic. If you were hardly seen during your life, after death, you might not be recognized. And yet, the greatest danger was not in death without a name, and in a life that is not yet over, but has already been recorded as completed. When a mistake becomes final. Death in Victorian London was rarely dramatic. More often, it was quiet. No screaming, no stage, no witnesses. The person simply stopped moving. In the 19th century, confirming death was much less precise than it seems to us today. There were no machines. There were no electronic indicators. There were no signals from monitors that we are used to. There was only observation, breathing, pulse, reaction. But what to do when breathing is almost imperceptible? When the pulse is so weak that it is difficult to find even for an experienced hand? When the body is cold after a long illness? Catalepsy, deep unconsciousness, comatose states, exhaustion, hypothermia. These words sounded different then, but the phenomena existed. Sometimes a person looked dead, absolutely, motionless, pale, cold, without obvious signs of life. Imagine a doctor. He is tired. The day is long. There are many calls. In front of him is a body. He checks. There is no reaction. No breathing is visible. no pulse is felt. A decision must be made, and it sounds short. Died. This word had the force of a sentence. It set the mechanism in motion. Documents, transportation, morgue. The morgue did not double-check the diagnosis with the same anxiety. The logic of the system worked here. The doctor had already said it. And so, a person who could still live found himself in a space for the dead. The cold room did not forgive weakness. The temperature slowed everything down, including sensations. If consciousness returned slowly, the cold came first. Not fear, not yet. It was the cold. Then the heaviness of the body. Muscles did not obey immediately. The chest moved slowly. The air seemed thick, and only then, awareness. The darkness was not homely. The silence was not night. The surface beneath you was stone, marble. The mind was still searching for an explanation. Hospital? Sleep? Delusion? But the smell was different. Not medicine, not life. Of cold stone, moisture, metal. And then comes the real fear. Because the body is not in the bed, the body is on the table, in a place where the living are not expected. Panic in such a situation does not explode immediately. It grows, slowly, like a crack in glass. An attempt to move, weak, failed. An attempt to breathe deeper, painful. An attempt to scream, and the voice, not the one you remember. The cold steals strength. In the morgue of Victorian London, there was no wake-up scenario. There was no call button. There was no person on duty constantly looking at the monitors. There was only a periodic presence, an employee, examination, procedures. And if the moment of regaining consciousness coincided with absolute loneliness, a person was left alone with his worst awareness, alive, among the dead. But even that wasn't the worst thing. The worst thing was time. Because in the cold, feelings change. Minutes stretch. The silence becomes loud. Every sound seems either salvation or a sentence. Footsteps. In the morgue, the sound of footsteps sounds special. Death. Slow. Inevitable. And if these footsteps approach, a person doesn't yet know. Help? Or the beginning of an autopsy? A mistake in diagnosis could have become a tragedy that no longer had witnesses. Because the morgue is a place where the movement of the body was not always explained by a miracle. Sometimes by reflexes. Sometimes by posthumous contractions. Sometimes by imagination. But the stories remained. Whispers, newspaper notes, rumors among the workers. And behind each such story was one thought that frightened Victorian society more than death itself. What if it happens to me? The cold that doesn't allow you to wake up. The cold in the morgue was not a feeling. It was an environment. It was not the cold that comes in the winter outside, not the kind that pinches your cheeks and makes you quicken your steps. It was a cold that was immobile, the kind that didn't change. It didn't weaken. It didn't retreat. The marble tables kept it silent. Stone knew no pity. It knew no compassion. It didn't know the difference between a body and an object. In Victorian London, cold was part of the procedure. It slowed down decomposition. It delayed change. It gave you more time for inspection, for notes, for decisions. But for someone who wasn't dead yet, the cold became an enemy. Imagine a body that begins to return to consciousness, slowly, as if from deep water. The mind is not the first to react. The skin. The cold penetrates the senses before fear. It tightens the muscles, makes movements difficult. Breathing is superficial. Consciousness returns in fragments, without a clear picture, without understanding. And in this half state, the morgue gives no hint that you are alive. On the contrary, everything around convinces you of the opposite. Silence. In the morgue, it is different. Not nocturnal, not calm. It is the silence of absence. It does not contain the random sounds of life. No voices behind the wall. No street traffic. No footsteps of passers-by. Only sometimes a drop. Somewhere in the darkness. Water slowly falls into a metal sink. The sound becomes enormous, disproportionate, almost unbearable. Because in complete silence, every small noise turns into an event. And if a person lies still, unable to get up right away, time begins to behave strangely. Minutes drag on. Seconds seem longer than hours. The cold not only squeezes the body, it squeezes the mind. Movement requires effort. A scream requires strength. Getting up is almost impossible. But the fear grows. It doesn't explode. It grows. Slowly. Like darkness gathering before a storm. The light in the morgue has never been bright. Gas lamps, faint glare, shadows that seemed deeper than space itself. The shapes of the bodies under the cloth looked almost motionless silhouettes. Human, and no longer. For someone who wakes up in this landscape, reality breaks down. The mind tries to find logic. Dream? Delusion? Hospital? But the surface beneath you is cold. The cloth is rough. The air is alien. And then a thought comes. One. Clear. Paralyzing. They think I'm dead. Panic behaves in a special way in the cold. It doesn't give you strength. It steals it. Breathing quickens. The heart beats faster. But the body is weak. The scream may be quiet. Movement is minimal. And if there is no one around, the morgue remains indifferent. Because this place is not designed for rescue. Sometimes the workers have mentioned strange things. A barely noticeable movement of tissue. An incomprehensible sound. A feeling that someone has changed position. But the morgue is a space of explanations. Post-mortem changes. Reflexes. Gases. Imagination. The mind is protected by rationality. And while the explanation sounds convincing, the test may not happen. The cold gives the dead more time. But it takes away the chances of the living. Because in an icy environment, weakness becomes deeper. Consciousness can fade again. Movement stops. Strength runs out. And then, the mistake becomes final. The morgue silently accepts what the system has already decided. The man on the table. The morgue was a place of silence, but not a place of motionlessness. Workers came and went. Lamps were turned on and off. Cloths were removed and covered again. Death here was a process. In Victorian London, morgues were more than just storage. They were part of an investigation. Here, causes of death were determined. Here, signs of violence were looked for. Here, the body became evidence, and evidence had to be examined. The marble table was not a symbol. It was a work surface, cold, steady, emotionless. Imagine this scene. The gas lamp casts an uneven light. Shadows flicker on the walls. Metal tools flash in brief flashes. There is a smell in the air. Stone, moisture, and something sharper. Metal. The morgue worker was not a villain. He was part of the system, a man of procedure. His movements are precise, calm, familiar. The tissue shifts. To a dead body, this means nothing. To a living one, this is the moment when horror takes shape. Because the first sensation is not pain, fear. Fear is so deep that the mind is not immediately able to comprehend it. The body is still weak, muscles tense with cold. Breathing is ragged. And there above you is a figure, light behind it, face in shadow, metal in hand, scalpel. In the morgue, this instrument had no emotion. It was ordinary, working. But for someone who is still alive, it becomes a symbol of the border between error and catastrophe. Panic at this moment behaves chaotically, trying to move, trying to breathe, trying to make a sound. But the cold keeps the body silent. Imagine this paradox. You are alive. Your heart is beating. Consciousness has returned. But the world around you has already denied you this right. The morgue does not wait for a reaction. And if the reaction is weak, it may not be noticed. A barely noticeable movement of a finger, an almost invisible trembling of the lips, a faint sound. In a space where absolute stillness is expected, minimal life looks like a coincidence, or like an illusion. Workers are used to trusting expectations. A body in the morgue is dead. That is an axiom. And it was this certainty that made the mistake deadly. Sometimes stories appeared in the newspapers. Strange, alarming, almost unbelievable. Movement in the morgue. A sound from under the cloth. An unexpected awakening. They were read with disbelief, but the fear remained. Because behind each such story was a question that Victorian society was afraid to formulate directly. How many such cases did no one notice? The morgue was a place where a person could find himself in the most terrible trap, not between life and death, but between the solution of the system and the reality of the body. The scalpel approaches not as a threat, as a procedure. And if at this very moment a weak body finds its last reserve of strength, the impossible may happen. Movement. Sharp. Desperate. Instinctive. A moment that breaks the logic of the morgue. Because the dead do not move. And if they do move, this is no longer a normal situation. This is a shock, the motion that could not happen. In the morgue, there was a rule that no one uttered aloud. The dead do not move. It was not just logic. It was the basis of calm, that which allowed one to work without fear, without doubt, without constantly expecting the impossible. The worker entered the cold room with confidence. The bodies were immobile. The procedures were predictable. Reality was stable. And that is why any deviation from this immobility had the force of an explosion. Imagine a moment. The silence was thick. The light of the lamp was uneven. The scalpel in his hand flashed with a cold glare. And suddenly, movement. Not much, barely noticeable. A finger, an eyelid, a chest. At first, the mind refuses to believe. A visual error, a shadow, a post-mortem reflex. Because to admit otherwise is to accept a terrible idea. The body is alive. In Victorian medicine, they believed in strange post-mortem phenomena. Muscle contractions, unexpected sounds, movements caused by gases. These explanations were convenient. They protected the psyche. But sometimes the movement was repeated, and then the peace was broken completely. The worker freezes. The scalpel is no longer a tool. It becomes a question. The light of the lamp seems brighter. The shadows are deeper. The air is heavier. Because now the impossible is present in the room. He lives among the dead. The reaction could have been different. Shock, fear, disbelief, panic. But most often, it's a delay, brief, fatal. The mind tries to find rationality where it's no longer enough. Can I really see this? Could the body? No, that's impossible. But the body moves again, weakly, desperately, instinctively. And then the morgue ceases to be a place of procedure. It becomes a place of decision. Because if a person is alive, every second counts. The cold has already done its job. The body is exhausted. Strength is at its limit. Consciousness is fragile. And even rescue at this moment did not guarantee safety. Hypothermia, shock, irreversible changes. The morgue could become a place of a second sentence. But there was something else, the fear of the worker. Because if a body that was thought to be dead came to life, that meant a terrible truth. The system had made a mistake. And a mistake in the world of death never sounded like a small thing. It threatened not only the life of the person on the table, it threatened trust to the doctors, to the procedures, to the very concept of death. Sometimes such cases were hushed up. Sometimes they were explained. Sometimes they were turned into strange stories that quickly lost their details. But for those who were in the room at that moment, this was not a story. This was a collision with the impossible. A movement that could not have been. A movement that decided fate. Silence after shock. After the impossible, there is always a pause. Movement. The one that could not have been. The one that breaks the order on which the entire cold logic of the morgue rests. The worker freezes. The world seems to stop with him. The lamp no longer flickers. The shadows do not move. Even the air seems still. There is only one thought. Slow, heavy, inevitable. It lives. This realization does not come as a scream. It comes as a cold. Because if the body lives, everything that has happened up to this point becomes suspicious. Diagnosis, examination, recording, transportation, every step of the system suddenly loses its indisputability. The morgue had no instructions for such a case. There was no clear procedure, because the system does not like scenarios that destroy its confidence. And while the employee's mind is trying to catch up with reality, time passes, and on the table is a person, alive, weak, frozen. Her movements can be chaotic, convulsive, desperate, not because she is strong, because fear is stronger than cold. Imagine this state. Consciousness is fragmented. The body is almost unresponsive. Breathing is harsh and painful. Eyes open into a world that should not exist for the living. A world of marble, shadows, fabrics, and figures above you. For the morgue employee, this moment was a psychological catastrophe, because what lay before him a moment ago as a body now stared, sometimes straight into the eyes. No habit prepares for this. The morgue is a place of absolute certainty. The living outside, the dead inside, and suddenly the boundary disappears. The reaction could have been instinctive: to retreat, to drop the instrument, to call someone, sometimes to simply run away, a step back, as if from a dangerous animal. Because the fear in this scene was born from a paradox. The dead became alive. But there was another fear, quieter, deeper. What if it's too late? Because the cold of the morgue does not disappear instantly. Even if life returned, the body could have been too exhausted. Heart on the verge, breathing unstable. Rescue did not guarantee recovery. Sometimes the miracle lasted minutes, sometimes seconds. Sometimes a person regained consciousness only to die definitively, no longer as a mistake, as a fact. The morgue became the place of a second ending. For the system, such a case was inconvenient. It questioned reliability, competence, the very mechanism of determining death. And so many stories dissolved in silence, without newspapers, without investigations, without explanations, only as whispers among those who worked behind the cold door. There was one body. It moved. The phrases were short, uncertain, as if even memory was afraid to speak too loudly. Because if this really happened more often, that would mean a terrible truth. The morgue was not always the endpoint. Sometimes it was a trap. The fear that overcame the city. Fear in Victorian London spread faster than disease. It didn't need proof. A story was enough. One, a whispered story. A man woke up in a coffin. A body stirred in the morgue. The doctor made a mistake. A city that saw death every day was strangely vulnerable to this horror, because ordinary death is order, and death that turned out to be not death, it's chaos. The newspapers knew the power of such stories. The headlines appeared regularly, alarming, sensational, almost theatrical. Some of the stories were exaggerations. Some were hearsay. Part of it was a terrifying truth. But for the reader, the difference lost its meaning. Fear became personal, because everyone who read it imagined the same thing: themselves, in the dark, without air, underground. Premature burial became one of the strongest phobias of the era. People were afraid not only of dying, they were afraid of dying wrongly. Waking up where there was no chance to call for help. Waking up when the system had already decided everything. This fear gave birth to strange solutions. Safe coffins. The idea seemed almost brilliant. A bell inside, a rope to the surface, a signal mechanism. If a person came to life, he could give a sign. The very design of the coffin became an admission of a disturbing truth. We are not absolutely sure. Inventors, entrepreneurs, craftsmen quickly sensed the demand. Fear became a market. Advertisements promised peace, protection from the worst, guarantee, security even after death. But the paradox remained. If a person needs a coffin bell, so society is making a mistake. And this thought was unbearable, because it destroyed the sense of control. Death must be certain. But the stories did not disappear. They were passed down by families. They were discussed in pubs. They were feared in the silence of the bedroom before going to sleep. What if this happens to me? In this atmosphere, the morgue ceased to be just a technical place. It became a last chance, a final pause before the earth, and at the same time, a source of new fear. Because if a person can wake up in a coffin, why not in a morgue? A cold room, marble, fabric, a place where the living are not expected. The city lived with this anxiety for years. It seeped into culture, into literature, into conversations, into the collective imagination. Death was no longer an instant limit. It became a zone of uncertainty, between diagnosis and finality, between silence and the terror of awakening, between death and burial. In Victorian London, death did not always mean immediate burial. There was a pause between these events, and in this pause there lay a tension that the city preferred not to notice. The body was rarely buried immediately. It was awaited by procedures, examination, confirmation, recording, sometimes identification. The morgue became a way station, a place where death was to become final, officially. This delay seemed reasonable, humane even. It allowed for mistakes to be avoided. It gave more time. But in reality, it created a new zone of risk. Imagine a body that had already been declared dead. It was transported. It was laid on marble, covered with a cloth, all decisions made. And suddenly, life returns. Weak, unstable, almost elusive. At this moment, a person is in the most dangerous space. She is still alive, but the world is already treating her as if she were dead. There is no monitoring of the condition. There is no expectation of a reaction. There is no readiness to save. Because the pause between death and burial was created for the dead, not for those who mistakenly fell into this category. The morgue is a place of waiting for irreversibility. But irreversibility did not always come on time. Medicine at that time did not have a universal test for death. The signs were indirect. No breathing, no pulse, no reaction. But they could all be deceptive, especially after exhaustion, fever, poisoning, hypothermia. States where the body almost disappears from the surface of life. And if a mistake was made, a pause did not guarantee safety. It could become a delay trap. Because the cold slowed not only decomposition, it slowed rescue. A person who regained consciousness in the morgue was often too weak to immediately give an obvious signal. Movement was minimal. Voice was quiet. Breathing was ragged. And the silence of the morgue remained deaf to weakness. In this zone between already dead and still alive, seconds had the weight of life. But the system measured them differently, by schedule, by order, by procedure. Sometimes a person got a chance, sometimes not, because if consciousness returned too late, Even the discovery of a mistake did not mean salvation. The organism could already be on the verge of death. The morgue became the place of a second sentence. Not by intention, by being late. In the Victorian imagination, this pause between death and burial seemed like a guarantee. In reality, it was a lottery. When the system starts to doubt. The system does not like doubt. It is built on certainty, on rules, on procedures, on the certainty that each stage is correct. In Victorian London, determining death was part of that certainty. The doctor confirmed it. The document was drawn up. The body was transported. The mechanism works. But what happens when a crack appears in the mechanism? Stories of wrongful deaths could not remain just urban legends. They became too much in conversation. They appeared too often in the newspapers. They penetrated too deeply into people's fears. And then, even the most conservative institutions started to get nervous. Not publicly. Be careful. New guidelines are emerging. Wait longer before burial. Check more carefully for signs of death. Be more careful with suspicious conditions. Death is no longer perceived as an instant certainty. It becomes a diagnosis that requires greater certainty. Doctors find themselves in a strange position. On the one hand, society demands accuracy. On the other, science does not yet have absolute tools. The line remains blurred. Imagine a doctor in front of a body. Now, the fear of making a mistake already lives in his mind. He checks longer. He listens more carefully. He looks for a pulse more carefully. Because one wrong word can become not only a tragedy, but a scandal. The morgue is also changing its role. It becomes not just a place of waiting, it becomes a place of doubt. The workers become more attentive. A barely noticeable movement is no longer so easily ignored. A strange sound is not always attributed to reflexes, because fear has crept in here too. But even with increased caution, the problem does not disappear completely, because it is not just a matter of inattention, it is a matter of the very nature of death. There were states that were almost indistinguishable from it: deep coma, catalepsy, severe hypothermia. The body could appear completely lifeless, and yet life could remain. The system begins to live in a new tension between the need to act quickly and the fear of acting too soon. Because delaying the burial also had consequences: hygiene, place, resources, organization. The city of death could not afford endless waiting. And so the compromise remained fragile. A little more checks, a little more time, a little more hope, and a little more fear. Because now everyone knew a mistake is possible. And if it happens, the most terrible thing happens not at the moment of death, but at the moment when life returns too late. Silent tragedies. Not all tragedies made headlines. Victorian London loved sensationalism, but only those that could be presented beautifully. A loud scandal, a strange incident, a terrible story. But there were other tragedies, silent, without witnesses, without investigations, without public outrage, those that dissolved into statistics. Imagine a person who really woke up in a morgue, weak, disoriented, almost without strength. Her movements could be too minimal. Her voice was too quiet. Her presence was too unexpected for the system. And if at that moment no one was nearby, the morgue remained indifferent. The cold did its thing. The body, barely clinging to life, found itself in an environment where every minute worked against it. Hypothermia does not scream. It takes it slowly. Consciousness fades again. Breathing weakens. The heart slows down. And if the moment of rescue had not come, life could have been extinguished for good. Not as a mistake, as a fact. And no one would ever know that between these two deaths there had been a short, desperate struggle. The system sees only the result. The body has been delivered. The body has been preserved. The body shows no signs of life. The recording is complete. There was no trace of panic in the morgue, like in the coffin. There were no scratches on the lid. There was no obvious evidence of struggle. Just a guess. And even if the worker had ever noticed something strange, memory tends to protect itself. It seemed so. Probably the movement of air. Posthumous contraction. Because the other version was too scary. The person was alive and died here. Such tragedies did not fit into a comfortable picture of the world. They had no audience. And without an audience, the story quickly lost its chance of becoming reality. The fear of premature burial lived in society precisely because the coffin left evidence. The morgue was silence without testimony. Here, a mistake could remain without history, without drama, without publicity, without memory. Just one of thousands of deaths in a city where death was commonplace. And that's what makes the morgue one of the most disturbing places of the era. Because if a mistake was made here, it could disappear without a trace. The last limit. Victorian London feared death, but even more, it feared uncertainty. Death as an event was understandable, sad, inevitable, usual for a 19th century city. But death that could turn out to be a mistake, this is another dimension of fear. The morgue stood precisely on this boundary, not between life and death, between certainty and doubt. Marble tables, cold air, silence that does not raise questions. Here the body awaited the verdict, which had almost been pronounced. Sometimes rightly, sometimes no. The history of Victorian morgues is not a horror story in our usual sense. It is a story of fragility, the fragility of medicine, the fragility of diagnosis, the fragility of the very boundary which people tried to call final. Because death does not always come loudly. It can be silent, almost imperceptible, almost indistinguishable from deep oblivion. And in the 19th century, humanity was only just learning to recognize this difference. The fear of premature burial, the fear of waking up in a coffin, the fear of the morgue, all this was not a fantasy of the era. It was a reflection of real uncertainty. Medicine was not omnipotent. The system was not infallible. The human body was not always predictable. And therefore, the morgue became a symbol of one of the deepest existential fears. What if they decide that I am dead? When am I still alive? Today, the line between life and death seems much clearer. Monitors, cardiograms, protocols. But history reminds us, confidence was not gained immediately. It grew out of fears, out of mistakes, out of silent tragedies which often went unreported. The morgue of Victorian London was a place of silence. But this silence was never completely safe. Because sometimes the scariest thing in the story of death is not death itself, and the moment when life has not yet gone, but the world has already moved on without you. Pause. Could you survive this? waking up in a cold room where no one is waiting for the living, where marble is colder than fear, where silence seems final. This is not a horror story. This is history. If you like real stories about the dangers of the past, subscribe to the channel, and we will continue our journey to those places in history where survival was never guaranteed.